In this video, we are doing a deep dive into potatoes, one of the most unique ingredients found in almost every cuisine around the world. However, even though potatoes are something we eat all the time, it's an ingredient I have a lot of questions about. For example, what is the best potato for frying, mashing, or baking? What's the starchy difference between russets, Yukon Gold, or red potatoes? Why are some potatoes purple in color? And why are sweet potatoes called potatoes when they're from a completely different botanical family? So to answer these questions and many more, this video is broken down into 3 sections. First, how are potatoes grown and why did they become popular? Second, the 5 potato molecules every home cook should know. And third, how potatoes affect the 6 flavor fundamentals. In the first section, we'll dive into where potatoes come from, how they are grown, and the 4 most common potato varieties that are commercially produced. In the second section, we'll break down the molecule differences in common potato varieties, explain why sweet potatoes are different than regular potatoes, and why waxy versus starchy is a pretty useless generic term. Lastly, in the third section, we will walk through the 6 flavor properties in order to understand how we use potatoes in our cooking and do several different tests comparing the taste, aroma, and texture of various potato varieties from russets to reds to Yukon Golds. And by the end of this video, I promise you'll understand when to use certain potato varieties in your cooking and how to get the most out of them. Before we dive in, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Bombas, and my theory when it comes to buying socks. Bombas makes comfort-focused basics such as socks, underwears, and t-shirts, and for every one purchase means one donated for those in need. Now, when buying socks, my theory is that they fall under 2 categories. First are your everyday sock, and secondly are your specialty socks. For an everyday sock, I just want them to be functional and comfortable. So for me, these are the Bombas Hex-Tech all-purpose performance socks, and I just load up with 6 of the exact same pair. I want to keep it really simple for the laundry, so I don't need to mess around with time matching them, and then if I do lose one, it's not as big of a deal. Now, depending on your line of work, maybe you're into quarter calf socks, maybe you need a bunch of dress socks for work, but everybody needs a solid amount of everyday socks that they can rely on. Now, the second category of socks are specialty socks. These socks fit a specific use case, like hiking, knee-high socks, or a pair of comfy socks that you only wear during the winter. And I'd recommend stocking up on both because new customers can use my code Ethan20 or the QR code on screen to save 20% off your purchase. And remember, for every item purchased, that means one donated, so you help out those in need. So thanks again, Bombas, for sponsoring this video. But now, let's talk potatoes. Potatoes were originally indigenous to the moist, cool, and mountainous regions of Central and South America, and they were cultivated by humans more than 8,000 years ago, but remained a regional crop until the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange was the widespread transfer of plants, animals, people, cultures, diseases, and ideas between the Americas and the rest of the world following Christopher Columbus's voyages in 1492. Now, similar to tomatoes, when potatoes were first introduced to Europe, they were kind of met with some suspicion. But during the 1700s, they became a staple crop for poor people because potatoes were a highly nutritious and high-yield crop. Potatoes produce more calories per acre than most other staple crops such as wheat or corn. For example, at one point, Irish peasants were said to consume 5 to 10 pounds of potatoes per day to meet their macronutrient needs. However, reliance on a single crop like this is dangerous. The Irish potato famine was caused by a mold infestation that killed the potato plants. Quote, the infestation ruined up to 1/2 of the potato crop that year and about 3/4 of the crop over the next 7 years. Over the next few hundred years until today, potatoes spread to pretty much every country and cuisine around the world for 3 core reasons. First is the high yield and caloric density that we just talked about. Secondly is their culinary versatility. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the culinary aspects of potatoes in that third section, but for now, I think our friend Sam sums it up best.
Potatoes. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew.
And third, potatoes are relatively inexpensive and store for a long time in the root cellar, so it just makes sense that they became very popular. And how potatoes grow is really unique, as you can already see these little sprouts coming out of your potatoes. And Kevin is going to tell us the plant above the ground is pretty unassuming, but below the ground is where the magic happens.
When you see the humble potato growing above the ground, it honestly doesn't look that impressive. Here's one right here that sprouted up voluntarily in my garden from last year's crop. And sometimes you could mistake this for a weed, but of course it's what's going on underneath the soil that we care about when growing a potato. But here's what you have to know. They grow in a pretty unique way in that this is what you end up planting. Unlike most vegetable crops, you do not plant what's called a true seed, a little guy that you throw in the soil and sprouts up. You plant what's called a seed potato. This is one right here. This is called a red Norland variety. I also have one called a Sarpomira, but there's some really popular ones like Russet Burbank or Yukon Gold, but no matter what variety, they're all planted in pretty much the same way. You'll grab a potato like this, there'll be these little indentations. Those are called the eyes. And what will happen is those will do something called chitting or sprouting. And when you see little sprouts come out that are about a ½ inch to an inch in length, you'll drop that potato into a hole maybe 4 inches deep or so. You can even dig a trench or plant it in a 5-gallon bucket. But the key is this: as that potato grows, those sprouts are going to throw up growth that are going to come out of the soil like this, but the potatoes are going to grow on what are called stolons coming out off of that underground growth. So between where the potatoes planted and the soil surface and around this area is where those potatoes will form. So you have to do something called hilling. You'll grab some soil and mound it up around your potato as it grows. Or if you're growing in a bucket, continue to fill that bucket up more and more with soil to boost your potato yield. And the beauty of the potato is you can grow them pretty much from spring all the way through fall with the right variety and the right technique.
Now, if you end up deciding to grow your own potatoes, you can find tons of different varieties to plant. However, on a commercial level, they generally fall under 4 broad categories. This chart shows the 13 top potato producing states in the US and the 4 most common varieties that are grown here: russet, white potatoes, red potatoes, and yellow potatoes. Russet potatoes are by far the most popular variety in the United States, as they account for 70% of planted acres each year. And to me, this is pretty interesting that russets are so popular in the United States, because Justin in the community post let me know that russets are primarily only available in North America. The Russet Burbank variety itself was bred over 100 years ago, and now all of the long white fleshed russet potato varieties stem from that original, and there are quite a few types of russet potatoes that can make it to the grocery store in fresh potatoes or a potato product. McDonald's, for example, uses Russet Burbank, Russet Ranger, Umatilla Russet, and Shepherdie varieties for all of their French fries that are served around the world. Potatoes can be genetically engineered for processed food like chips, fries, whether they're fresh or frozen, and products like potato starch or instant potatoes. This means that certain kinds of potatoes are only accessible by corporations such as a fast food chain or a potato chip manufacturer, where they will develop specific varietals of potatoes for a very certain texture depending on the product they are making. For example, one of the secrets that Alex found out in his potato chip series was that Brett's Products uses the Lita Maria variety of potato. And naturally, this begs the question: if companies are willing to invest time, money, and research into specific potato varieties, what exactly are they changing inside of these things? And then how different do they end up from a taste, aroma, and texture standpoint? Well, friends, it is time for section 2. As noted on Cookwell, molecules are the building blocks of food, and the molecules in a particular ingredient or dish dictate what types of reactions they can go through and what their flavor will be, and potatoes are no different. All potato varieties are made up of 5 basic components: water at 78 to 81%, starch, which is generally 14 to 8%, around 2% protein, 0.5 to 1.2% for sugars, and around 1% of trace minerals and vitamins. For example, here is the USDA data on the 3 most common potatoes in the United States: the russet, Yukon Gold, and red potatoes. And we can see there are some slight differences in the amounts for these various potatoes. Generally, it is said that waxy potatoes have less starch, more moisture, and more sugar, and starchy potatoes have higher starch, less moisture, and less sugar. And if you look at these values, it would seem to be that these are the ones they use to categorize potatoes into waxy versus starchy. Now, you may look at these values and be like, oh yeah, it makes sense that, a starchy potato has more starch. However, I kind of had the opposite reaction and was like, you're telling me we call a russet potato a starchy potato because it has like a gram more starch on a 100-gram basis? To me, that just doesn't seem to quite add up. And after looking into the details, I'm going to recommend that we forget the terms waxy versus starchy or floury or baking versus boiling even exist. And I'm going to tell you why by explaining the difference between sweet potatoes and regular potatoes. For years, I assumed potatoes and sweet potatoes were part of the same family. I mean, it's in the name. But they belong to an entirely different botanical family and are unique species. Potatoes are part of the nightshade family, which includes tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers, while sweet potatoes belong to the morning glory family, which, when you see a sweet potato plant, the leaves look very similar to those of morning glory flowers. Now, from the USDA data, when raw without skin, sweet potatoes are made up of roughly 79.5% water, 11 grams of starch, 6 grams of sugar, 1.58 grams of protein, and similar 1 gram of minerals and vitamins. Now, for comparison, a lot of fruits on a 100-gram basis have 5 to 12 grams of sugar, depending on the fruit. Bananas are around 12 grams, apples are around 10, strawberries are 5, and watermelon is 6. So after looking at these numbers, maybe it makes sense that we call sweet potatoes sweet. However, it makes even more sense when you realize that sweet potatoes get even sweeter when you cook with them. Sweet potatoes contain a natural enzyme called amylase that is activated when the temperature rises above 135 degrees Fahrenheit and stays active to around 170 degrees Fahrenheit. This enzyme breaks down the starches into simpler sugars like maltose and glucose. So, if you slow cook a sweet potato at like 200 degrees in the oven, in theory, the enzymes will have more time to convert the starches into sugars and increase its sweetness compared to a sweet potato that was cooked at a hotter temperature for less time. And in this old video of mine, we learned there are 2 reasons why it's so hard to make crispy sweet potato fries. First is that they have less starch to start with than regular potatoes, and secondly, a lot of the starch they do have turns to sugar during that cooking process. This is why one of the solutions to making crispy sweet potato fries is to add a potato starch slurry to some boiled sweet potatoes before you fry them. And to summarize, the reason why we call sweet potatoes sweet is simply they have a lot more sugar to start with than the regular potatoes, and secondly, more starch turns to sugar during the cooking process than regular potatoes. And to me, the sweet potato is a good descriptor, but here's why waxy versus starchy is not. The taste, aroma, texture, and sight of a particular potato variety is going to be dependent on several factors: the total amount of water, the total amount of starch, protein, sugar, and that unique mix of minerals and vitamins. And then ultimately, added to that equation is how all of those change depending on the particular cooking process they go through, whether it's for French fries, hash browns, potato chips, mashed potatoes, or latkes. However, this does not even tell the full story because guess what? There are 2 different kinds of starch, amylose and amylopectin, and secondly, there are several different kinds of sugar. For example, if you listen closely in Alex's video, the Brett CEO first mentions the potatoes they use have less sugar overall, but also specifically mentions the ratio of sugars like glucose and fructose could have an impact on their product as well.
What we use is really specialized potato varieties that were especially developed to produce chips. Is what is the sugar contained in the potato. Sugars like fructose and glucose, and then it might give you a brown color.
Oh wow, because it's caramelizing.
From the beginning, in fact, the potato varieties we use are less sweet than, for instance, binge.
Now, we're not going to go too deep down this rabbit hole because we need to get to section 3 of this video. However, I do want to explain kind of a high-level summary of starch because the ratio of amylose to amylopectin seems to have an impact and potentially could explain why russet potatoes have a different texture than something like a Yukon Gold when they are cooked. Starch molecules are long chains of linked glucose sugar molecules that can take different polysaccharide forms, and in vegetables, fruits, and grains, you'll typically find these 2 components of starch. Now, according to On Food and Cooking, amylose is made up of a long, single chain of 1,000 or so glucose sugars that easily gets tangled and clustered into other molecules. Amylopectin, on the other hand, is made up of 5,000 to 20,000 glucose sugars, but in a much denser branched network. Both get packed together in starch granules in, say, a potato or a rice grain, but in different ratios depending on the particular variety. Now, when these starches are heated and combined with a liquid like the water in our potato, they absorb moisture and begin to swell, and this process is known as gelation. Most other vegetables tend to lose their water content when we cook with them, but potatoes are pretty unique because the high starch content absorbs the water and holds onto it, giving us a super unique texture that we all love, whether you boil them, mash them, or stick them in a stew. And this gelation process with different starch ratios in different potato varieties seems to be part of the reasons why they have different textures when we cook with them. Potato starch typically has a 3-to-1 ratio of amylopectin to amylose. However, russet potatoes on average seem to have higher levels of amylose. Quote, amylose content in tuber starch varied among cultivars, with the highest levels observed in the Ranger russet and white pearl, while it was lower in the Kennebec and Langlade cultivars. Additionally, in this 1994 study, there's an image showing cross-section of 4 different potato cultivars in 3 different preparations: the potato raw, the potato steamed, and then that potato steamed and mashed. And we can see the variation of the textures under the microscope when they're cooked, and this just makes sense. If you have a russet side by side to something like a red potato, it has a unique texture. So instead of trying to explain potatoes by just lumping them into 2 very broad categories like waxy versus starchy, to me it makes so much more sense to go variety by variety. Red potatoes, all the sub-red potato varieties. Yukon Gold, all the sub-Yukon Gold. Russet potatoes, all the sub-russet potato varieties. And I kind of want this master table where it's like the moisture content for each, both types of starches, the different sugars that make it up. All of that would be very, very interesting to me. And I tried to throw a query at ChatGPT just to see what it could come up with. I don't know how accurate or useful all of this data is, but this level of detail is kind of what I'm imagining, a corporation or a researcher is going to use when they are kind of testing out different varieties. And I would love to know, what does have the biggest impact here? Is it the total amount of moisture? Is it the total amount of starch? Or is it the ratio of those 2 different starches? How do the sugars come into play? And how they're all intertwined? So if anyone has additional context to those questions, let me know down in the comments. However, for purposes of this video, here is the takeaway from section 2. The taste, aroma, texture, and sight of a particular potato variety is going to be dependent on the water content, the starch content, the ratio of amylose to amylopectin, the total amount of protein, sugar, the ratio of the sugar, and the unique mix of minerals and vitamins. So it would be nice to have all that specific data of how everything works inside these potatoes, but as a home cook, you really don't need to go to that granular of a level, as we're going to test out in section number 3. I'm going to run potatoes through a variety of tests from a taste, aroma, and texture standpoint, and we're going to see how different some of these varieties end up being. So let's move to section 3. At a high level, these 6 properties make up the flavor of food: taste, aroma, sight, physical, texture, and the human element. And we're going to use these properties to explain the differences between potatoes and when you may want to use a certain variety over another in your cooking. As noted on Cookwell, there are 5 core taste our tongue registers: sweet, sour, bitter, umami, and salty. And ingredients are made up of different molecules, vitamins, and minerals that register on our tongue and then signal a specific taste to our brain. For example, we just talked in depth how the sodium in sodium chloride is what our tongue and brain registers as salty. Sugar molecules such as fructose and glucose in fruit are what cause us to taste sweet, and organic acids such as citric or malic are what our tongue and brain register as sour. And the balance of these 5 tastes can be a really important differentiator in what a particular fruit or vegetable tastes like. For example, the reason that a Granny Smith tastes more sour than a Golden Delicious apple is that it has about double the amount of total organic acids. So naturally, the question becomes, can you taste a difference between sweet, salty, bitter, sour, or umami in certain potato varieties? When they are raw, they can taste a bit bitter as they contain alkaloids, solanine, and chocoline, and these alkaloids can be toxic if they're consumed in large quantity, but one estimate says you need to eat 15 to 20 pounds of raw potatoes before that happens. Regardless, when potatoes are cooked, that bitterness goes away, and technically there is a tiny bit of sweetness due to the sugar content. However, as we've discussed, most common potato varieties contain roughly 0.5 to 1.2% sugar. So here I have some sous vide potatoes that have no salt added to them. They're just purely plain. And what I'm gonna do is actually plug my nose and just taste them. Potato 2. Interesting. All right, now the sweet potato. Wow, all right. So this is a really fundamental test, and it really explains like how we use potatoes. Because when you take away your nose, you'd be shocked at just how similar these all purely taste. It's just very neutral tasting. The one exception, obviously, here is the sweet potato. But even the sweet potato is not nearly as sweet as you would think it was. It's really, sweet potato's flavor is the combination of the taste and that aroma, which is what we're gonna talk about with flavor property number 2. So can you taste a difference between sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami taste in these potato varieties? Not significantly. And this just makes sense when you realize that when we cook with potatoes, we are typically adding taste to them. For example, French fries are sprinkled with salt, which is salty. We dip those French fries in ketchup, which is a mix of sweet, sour, and salty. We like salt and vinegar on our potato chips. We add gravy over our mashed potatoes. And then for potato salad, we'll typically boil them in a salty water. Or for a baked potato, we'll add butter, cheese, bacon, scallions to add a mix of taste and aromas. So any taste differences are going to become negligible by the strong tasting ingredients we typically add to them through cooking. So while potatoes do not have a strong taste, they can have unique aromas, depending on how it's used. Most of what we experience as taste is actually smell. An ingredient can really only have those 5 core tastes, but can have hundreds of different aromas that our nose can detect. If we saute onions or garlic, our kitchens are filled with wonderful aromas as soon as it hits the pan. Potatoes, on the other hand, are not a very strong smelling aromatic ingredient, but there are 2 primary ways potatoes affect the aroma. First is the aroma from the potato skin, and secondly, the aromas created through cooking. The flesh of potatoes does have some aroma, but really it's the skin of the potatoes what contains more of these strong smelling aromatics between the various varieties. And the fact that potatoes do not have a strong aroma is yet another reason why they are so useful in many different cuisines. Potatoes are a great canvas for adding spices and other aromatic ingredients like aloo masala from Indian cuisine, sour cream and onion potato chips, or garlic mashed potatoes. All these dishes let the aromatic ingredients shine. Now, outside of adding spices and aromatics, we can actually create aroma through cooking with 2 reactions: the Maillard reaction and caramelization. We have these broken down on Cookwell if you want to read more, but basically the Maillard reaction equals golden brown and delicious. This is a complex chemical process that occurs when amino acids and sugars react under heat, leading to the browning and development of hundreds of new aromas in various foods. This browning is what happens on our French fries and potato chips, and kettle chips, for example, have a more robust aroma compared to the lighter chips with almost no browning on them. Caramelization also causes browning, but is specifically the browning of sugar molecules. And since sweet potatoes have more sugar, this reaction is more prevalent and is part of what leads to the unique aroma compared to regular ones. Now, in the coffee deep dive, we learned that you can roast different varieties of green coffee and yield significantly different aromas in your coffee due to the Maillard reaction. And in theory, different potatoes will roast slightly different too, so I tried to see if I could tell the differences in some various roasted potatoes. So now I have 5 different varieties of roasted potatoes, and now we've significantly bumped up the aroma. So for these, I just quickly threw them into some salted boiling water to kind of start that cooking process. Then just drizzled a little oil over top and threw them in the air fryer. And then you can see these all browned up. So the red potato, this is the Yukon Gold, this is the russet potato, the sweet potato, and then this is a fingerling potato. And just from that initial smell, these 3 are actually fairly similar, much more similar than I think you would expect again. Sweet potato, significantly different, likely a mix of, again, just made up of different things, and then also probably a little bit more caramelization going on the outside in addition to the Maillard reaction. And then this one is pure potato skin versus this these were bigger potatoes. So that's kind of one of the advantages potentially of small potatoes like this in Aroma, is that you'll have significantly more potato skin, you know, for a similar sized piece like this. But let's give them a taste. It is amazing just how a little bit of salt and then like roasting potatoes makes them so much better than that first test we did. All right, number 2. I think I definitely like the Yukon Gold more than the red potato there. But not necessarily because of taste and aroma. Russet potato, the old classic. Sweet. Roasted sweet potatoes are really so unique. All right, then on to the fingerling. So really interesting test here, and I think what jumped out to me is the russet potato kind of has that classic like earthy aromaness to it, especially when you specifically bite into the skin. And then the fingerling, I would say more on like the nutty aroma side, less earthy than the russet, but more nutty. Really, really nice just because it's kind of packed with all that beautiful skin in there. The sweet potato, obviously incredibly unique from all of these just because significantly more sugar, likely more caramelization with the Maillard reaction. And then the red potato, solid. Again, I think fairly like neutralist, and then the skin is just like a little bit different, which I just doesn't, for me, doesn't work quite as well in like a roasted potato. And then the russet is kind of your old standby. So I think if I had to choose one out of these, like I really like this russet potato, just like from a pure roasted potato standpoint. And then the sweet potato is just very unique. And another reason why I like this Yukon Gold potato so much is actually because of its texture. So let's talk about the next few flavor properties. So to summarize, more potato skins equals more aroma, and more Maillard reaction equals more aroma. So this means you'll see the biggest difference in aroma in potato preparations that include the potato skin and go through the Maillard reaction. Next up is sight, and when choosing a potato variety to cook with, sight should not be overlooked. Our eyes are the first sense to interact with the food we eat, and we judge many of the other elements of flavor with our eyes. The texture, temperature, and cuisine can be assessed first by sight. And when it comes to potatoes, this is an important characteristic to consider. Potato size can range from massive russets to tiny baby potatoes. The potato skin can be white, brown, red, or purple, and the potato flesh can also be white, brown, yellow, red, or purple. And the natural pigments will dictate the color of a particular potato variety. For example, purple potatoes contain pigments called anthocyanins, which are the same compounds found in red cabbage, blueberries, and grapes. So the next time you are shopping for potatoes, think about how you want to use them visually and if it may make sense to choose an interesting looking potato. Next up is the physical element of flavor, which is less intuitive but important to consider. The physical elements of food that impact flavor are ingredients' temperature, spice level, astringency, and pungency. And in the onion deep dive, one of the differences in the raw taste that I did is that raw shallots were by far the most pungent. Red onions were also very pungent, and then surprisingly to me, the white, sweet, and yellow onions were all similar levels in pungency. And while the physical element is an important distinction for onion varieties when they're used raw, is it important for potatoes? No. Really, the only physical reaction that you could get is from eating 15 to 20 pounds of raw potatoes, which would be toxic to you. But outside of that, we cook potatoes and they are way more enjoyable this way. And hopefully this picture is starting to become more clear, because the most important flavor property when choosing a potato variety is the texture. The texture of potatoes are why they are one of the greatest ingredients in the world. And remember, that high starch level is what allows them to hold onto the moisture, and they can blend in with whatever cooking use case you want to use them for. If you want a crispy texture, slice them extremely thin and fry them into a chip. If you want a crunchy texture, cut them a little thicker and do a kettle fry. If you want them to have a tender texture, steam them. If you want them creamy, boil them and mash them with some butter and milk. If you want a crispy and airy texture, cut them into sticks and fry them into French fries. And if you want them crispy and creamy, cut them into bigger chunks for roasting. And like we discussed earlier, companies will try to optimize for a very specific potato texture for their potato products that are sold on a mass market level. But my question is, how important is it for us home cooks? So I took 4 potato varieties and then used them in 3 different textured preparations: mashed potatoes, french fries, and potato chips. And my goal with these tests is not to judge which is best, but merely to just give you my observation, and I've always wondered, how different do these textures end up being? So let's start with the mashed. For the mash test, I skinned and boiled 150 grams of each potato in salted water. Once they were tender, I added them to a bowl and added 15 grams of butter each. Now, milk or cream are common additions, but can significantly affect the texture, and I wanted to keep it simple for this first test. So we have the mashed potato test ready, which is good timing with Thanksgiving and Christmas coming up, normally when I have mashed potatoes. So let's blindfold up and see if we can notice any differences in texture. Oh, big bite. Really good buttery mashed potatoes. Number 2. This definitely just a little bit smoother than number 1. One had like a little bit of graininess. Number 3. Similar. I think 2 is the smoothest to me. It actually is kind of hard to tell the difference between these. This was actually much closer than expected. I think maybe 2 is the smoothest, but all of them really quite good. So let's see what we have. Interesting. Okay, so Yukon Gold, and you guys know this, I don't, red, and russet. Man, this is a really interesting test, much closer than I expected it to be. I would say the red potato for me has like the smoothest, cleanest texture. However, also feels like it could be prone to kind of getting a little bit gummy if you over whipped it and let it sit out for a longer time. But for like a fresh mashed potato, this really surprised me because this is really, really good. Then on the russet and the Yukon Gold, very close in texture, just like this subtle graininess to it. It's like these little tiny little things that you're feeling on your tongue. But I think the overall takeaway for me from this test is the potato is just one variable when you're making kind of mashed potato varieties. I mean, if you think about kind of the French style potatoes, they use like 40 to 50% kind of a mixture of butter and cream. So any differences in texture I'm able to see here might kind of be counterbalanced if you added, you know, butter, cream, milk, and those things, or the oligot, which has a ton of cheese and that's very stretchy. So while I am seeing a difference in red potatoes and kind of a pure mashed potato that I really like, you got to remember it is one variable that you need to consider potentially in many. And this first texture test has really got me interested now to see how these potato varieties stack up when we go to fry them and then completely crisp them up with some potato chips. For the french fries, I again took each of the red, russet, and Yukon Gold potatoes and chopped them into sticks. I first boiled them in salted water, then did the double fry method for french fries on the stove, and right away I could see some visual differences in how they browned. Okay, so I'll let all you decide and pop up a photo on screen of kind of a close-up look visually what these different french fries look like. I would say the Yukon Gold definitely browned up quicker than the other 2 varieties. Whether you like that look depends, I don't know, but let's give them a taste and see how different these textures really are. Okay. Number 1. Nice little salty, just like a slight crispy there. Really nice first one. Definitely more crispy, kind of crunchy texture throughout on that second one. Number 3. I would say that third one was kind of in between the first 2. Let me go back through. Okay, that's 3. Really, really interesting. I would say whichever this one is, my preferred texture for french fries. Okay, so this is a really interesting test. Definitely some textural differences in these, and the russet I would say did make the best overall, just like a nice balance between the texture inside and the outside. And that could be because I am very biased towards russet potatoes, obviously. I would say what surprised me here is actually the red potato much closer to the russet than the Yukon Gold, which did surprise me a little bit. Especially like these little smaller pieces of the red potato do really have a nice kind of crispy crunch to them. The Yukon Gold potato, definitely the least crisp inside, but the texture inside is like really, really nice and smooth. So I think the russet potato does really shine here, but this actually kind of surprised me how good the red potatoes ended up being. Like if all you happen to have was some red potatoes and really wanted French fries, like I would not be afraid to make them with these. Now this will be really interesting in the final test because we're going to completely take away all the water content, or most of it, and these should be completely crispy all the way through for the potato chip test. So let's give them a shot. Last up, for the chip test, I thinly sliced each potato variety on the mandolin, washed them in some salted water, dried them, and then added directly to that oil. And similar to the French fry, there were more noticeable differences in how they browned up. So we have the potato chip test, and I think my first takeaway is I would not bother making potato chips at home. I think just leave it up to the companies. They're gonna have a very consistent product every time. It's just really hard to dial in like really nice potato chips at home. And especially because we can see there are some clear differences in how these kind of fried up in general. I would actually say the Yukon Gold might look the best visually. However, when I actually crunch into these, there are some parts of it that are a little soft. And this is an example where kind of your eyes deceive you a little bit, where these look really crunchy, but yeah, there's just portions of them that are a little bit soft. And I was kind of afraid to fry them longer because like these already looked just about as brown as I would want to take them. Then on the other side, the red potatoes were fairly different in kind of, they browned up almost in the center like that, and there was a little hole in the potato. I don't know if that caused anything. But as far as texture goes, really nice. Like this is just a really nice kind of thicker, crunchy chip. So visually they look a little weird, but from a texture standpoint, I mean, the red potato really surprised me. It's really quite nice in this test. And then lastly, in the middle, of course, we have the old standby, the russet potato, which we kind of know is gonna fry up really nice. And to me, the russet here feels like it's the closest to kind of a nice kettle chip that you may get at the store. I think one of the takeaways that I kind of gained through these tests is that Yukon Gold might not be the best option for fried preparations of potatoes. You could definitely get around it though if you know what you have. Maybe you need to wash them a little bit longer, maybe boil them a little bit longer. But for me going forward, I think I'll probably stick to maybe boiled, baked, or mashed potato options when it comes to Yukon Golds. To end this video, we have the human element. And this is a reminder that we experience food not just with our physical senses, but through our emotions, nostalgia, and cultural associations. And when it comes to potatoes, the russet is very unique to North America, and it's a potato in the United States we have a natural bias towards. And here is my personal preference list for what potatoes variety to use in certain situation. For the russet potatoes, I primarily will use them for French fries. When it comes to the Yukon Gold, that is my preferred mashed potato. If I'm making roasted potatoes and confined fingerling potatoes, those are by far my favorite. The red potatoes, I like boiling and then mixing them with butter and parsley for a nice visual contrast. And then colored potatoes are just any time I want to make something visually interesting. And hopefully you're realizing if we understand how potatoes work, you can make amazing food regardless of the potato variety, as they are such an interesting ingredient. So in conclusion, I hope you now understand just about everything you wanted to know about potatoes and all the different varieties. It's truly such a unique ingredient that I think we just kind of take it for granted as something we eat all the time in French fries and chips or boiled, baked, and stews or whatever. But it is a really, really interesting ingredient, and you could imagine doing a whole like deep dive just into mashed potatoes using the information in this video. For example, some potatoes may hold up better to more whipping time. Some may set up better for a lot of heavy cream or cheese and things of that nature. So let me know down in the comments what you learned from this video, as well as if there's any additional context. I love reading when you guys leave me more information in the comments. It's like one of my favorite parts about these videos, and I think everyone else appreciates that too. So if you have any comments related to anything in this video, let us know. But anyway, that will wrap it up for me in this one. One last announcement. If you want to sign up for our newsletter, The Mouthful, it comes out every Sunday, and I think it's the best food and cooking newsletter on the internet. Outside of that, head to the link in the description for some recipes with potatoes if you want to, and let me know what your favorite thing to make with potato is. But that'll wrap it up for me in this one. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace, y'all.